Welcome back to another Service Management Leadership podcast. We're back with David Cannon talking about the basics of service management. Welcome back, David.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Good to be back again.
Yes, we always love to have you on the podcast. So a nice, straightforward question that's not as easy to answer as it is for me to ask. If you were asked to initiate or to improve a service management organization or program, where would you start?
You can start any way you like. It depends what's important to you.
Right.
But here are some guidelines. And again, these are my opinions. And I would love to see some of the comments back from some of our listeners and viewers. But one of the first things I would say is whatever you do, don't start with a tool. There is a school of thought that says the tool developers have put a lot of thought and work developed from a number of organizations into the function of their tool. And therefore, you'd be very well off if you just started by listening to what they have put in place, by implementing what they put in place and using those practices. It's not a very good approach. And that is because the tool was not developed for us. In addition, a lot of service management tools right now are focusing on the more commoditized components. So a lot of those service management tools will take the bare bones of incident management, for example, or change management, but they require you to be able to build all of the nuances that you need to support your organization. So if all you're going to do is take a tool, implement it, and that's your starting point, it's okay, but it's not going to meet the nuances that you as an organization are going to need. If you then go back to the developers and say, or to the vendor and say, well, how do I do X in my organization? They will give you an answer, but it may not be the optimal answer for your culture or for the way in which your organization works. So rather not start with a tool, start with really what is the most important thing for you in your organization right now. And that is, strangely enough, the agenda of your senior leaders. Interestingly, there was a benchmark report run by PeopleCert and Axelos that has just been released. And one of the key issues faced by service managers is that they do not have the support of senior management. That's a very interesting point for me, because surely service management is there to facilitate and enable the strategy of the organization to be effective. Now, if we can't get the support of senior managers, where's the disconnect? Why are we not doing the things in our service management program that are needed, that are high priorities for our senior managers to be able to achieve the strategy of the organization? So one very important thing is to get on the same page as the leadership, certainly the CIO, but as many other senior leaders as politically feasible for you to get in touch with. Find out what it is, where is this organization going, what are its major needs right now, and that's really what you should be focusing on. Now, the other thing is it all depends what you have in place as well already. It's likely that as an organization, if you've been functioning for any period of time, you probably have some very good processes in place for fixing things that are broken, for making changes to things. The key there is not to reinvent them, but it's to figure out what components of those work well, and then to really formalize them. And to do that, I think the continual improvement model is very helpful. Now, the continual improvement model, there is a version of this in ITIL, and there's quite a lot of information, even at the foundation level, about how this model works. And I think the steps in that model are very helpful. The other thing that's very helpful out of ITIL are the guiding principles, one of which says start where you are, and then be practical, keep things simple. Those are very good pieces of advice. And then two other things that I would recommend. One is take a look at the whole framework, but don't try and implement everything all at once. The most important question to ask is, what is important for me right now? and what will become important as soon as I have resolved or at least put in place a solution for those things. So consider the whole framework, make sure you know where the long term, what that looks like, what the big picture is, but don't try and implement it all at once. Take those pieces that are most important for you right now. And when I talk about framework, of course, I'm not just talking about ITIL. I really am talking about the frameworks that are used within your organization, the way in which your organization gets things done. ITIL can be very helpful to identify some of those, but there are other frameworks in the industry that can also be very helpful. And we don't have to look very far. DevOps, Agile, COBIT, etc. All of those have some really relevant guidance and helpful guidance depending on what kind of organization you are. So consider them. And then finally, I would say at the stage where we are in the industry right now is we should be building a formalized service management structure. This is not just a kind of loose thing that is left up to various people to play roles semi-formally. There are certain processes, practices, tools, which really should be maintained and overseen from a central point of view, even if they're executed in a distributed way. Things like the coordination of multiple change environments or changing environments. So change enablement at a very high level, so differentiate between change enablement at a centralized level and change enablement that has to happen in individual teams. But make sure that there is some sort of consistency between all of them. So I've heard this called a number of things. We've, of course, spoken about the service management office in the past. Another term that I like is the middle office, which is the office between the consumers of services and those internal technical groups that provide those services. And another one that's becoming really, that's getting a lot of traction these days is the service integration function, which is a way of managing multiple internal and external service providers using some sort of consistent governance in the organization. I'm trying to avoid the word centralized because these are not necessarily centralized. But they should be consistent and they should be formal and they should be linked and integrated as far as possible. So yeah, summarize, try and create a formal structure and approach. Consider the whole framework, but implement what you need right now. Don't start with a tool. And I find that the continual improvement model steps are very helpful in doing this.
So when you were going through that and you mentioned the guiding principles, I was tracking the guiding principles with you. Focus on value. Yes.
Yep.
Start where you are. Yes. Iterate with feedback. Yes. And so the other piece too, when you mentioned centralized, decentralized, I always think of how do we create standardized outcomes with people that speak different languages, different business units, different time zones. And we really don't care about the how, we just care about the outcomes being standardized. So the procedures, the work instructions, they may look different, but that's okay.
That's right. I think we've come out of over the last 30 years, the corporate culture has evolved from being a heavily control-centric to being a lot more outcome-centric. So while controls are important at a certain level, to a greater and greater degree, how work gets done is left up to the teams that actually do the work.
Right.
They're still accountable for what they do. They're still accountable to make sure that it is within the policies of the organization, within legal bounds, et cetera, et cetera. But the actual methods they use and the controls that they use internally is becoming largely up to them. So we're seeing a very much of a flattening of organizations, de-hierarchicalizing, if you like, of organizations. And that brings with it challenges as well. How do you coordinate across multiple semi-autonomous teams? How do you make sure that where standards are necessary, that you're able to communicate those and measure them and make sure they're complied with? But there is definitely that evolution that is taking place. And it's sometimes challenging to be able to exercise governance over some pieces that do need heavy regulation and control, and those that do not need heavy regulation and control. How do you get them to work together? And these are some of the things that you know, as we go through implementing service management programs, those kind of questions will keep coming up. And again, take it a step at a time. You will not find a single piece of guidance that gives you the answers to these. You'll find some pieces of it in a more agile approach. You'll find some pieces of it in ITIL. You'll find some pieces in Lean. You've got to be able to navigate your way through those frameworks in order to be able to figure out which components are going to be best suited for the different groups and how to tie them together.
Oh, yes. And that's a great place for us to end this brief podcast. Stay tuned for next week. Next episode, we'll talk about incident management, just because it's central to most of how our stakeholders interface with IT. They don't want to see us until something's down, and then we're their best friend. The phone rings off the hook. So a term for, maybe you younger people don't get that reference, but the phone rings often. So David, thank you for sharing your expertise with us, and audience, come back next week as we talk about incident management.
Thanks. Looking forward to it.
Bye.